Pet Sematary, a seemingly typical Stephen King story about a special burial ground where if you bury your dead, they come back but different. This story has been adapted a few times, and it may seem like just a gruesome, spooky surface level story, but I've watched the 1989 adaptation, and honestly, there's some moments, and one big scene in particular, that makes me think there's something deeper going on with this story than it's often given credit for. So today I'm talking about Mary Lambert's 1989 adaptation of Pet Sematary and why it deserves more credit. Also, hi there, I'm Shayna, and this is my channel, Shayna Says, where I share my opinions on culture, media, and pop culture. Subscribe to my channel to help it grow. Or I'll do something unthinkable. Like brush my teeth with my left hand. Okay, so Pet Sematary. Quick disclaimer, I've never read the book, and I've only seen some of the 2019 adaptation, so just know that the plot and info I share is strictly based on the 1989 film adaptation and my experience watching it. So this adaptation of Pet Sematary came out in 1989 and was directed by Mary Lambert. And until looking this up just now, I didn't realize it was directed by a woman. Neat. Really quickly, if you haven't seen it, here's a brief summary. Major spoilers ahead, obviously. So Pet Sematary follows the Creed family. That's Louis and Rachel, their children Ellie and Gage, and their pet cat Church. Interesting name. So we join the Creed family just as they have moved from Chicago to rural Maine, and Louis is going to be a doctor at a hospital, and they got this friendly neighbor Judd. So the family is adjusting to rural life, and the road they live on is dangerous, and people get hit by trucks a lot. Oh well, I'm sure that won't come up later. Church the cat dies, and Louis is worried about how crushed his daughter Ellie will be, so Judd shows him the pet cemetery. He's like, hey, bury the cat here. It will come back to life. And then that cat comes back to life, but it's different. And by different, I mean evil and aggressive. And Judd is like, oh yeah, they come back that way. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have told you to do that at all, but we were caught up in little Ellie being sad, and I let logic go through the window. And remember that thing about the road being dangerous and how that probably wouldn't come back up? Oh yeah, it came back up big time, and tragically their little son Gage gets hit by a car and dies. And stricken with grief, obviously, Louis decides to bury Gage in the pet cemetery so he can come back to life, even if it means some weird demonic version of him that's not really him anymore comes back. And that's what happens. And Gage kills the whole family basically, except Louis, who is killed by his dead wife after he decides to bury her in the pet cemetery too, thinking this time things will work out right. Yeah, when I describe it like that and don't get into the nitty-gritty details, this movie sounds both awesome and kind of ridiculous and dumb. And it really didn't get the best reception, with a 55% on Rotten Tomatoes from the critics and 60% from audiences. And I get it, there really aren't any big stars in the film, and some people say the cast was lackluster. And again, I haven't read the book, but I think some fans of the book didn't really like it, and sure, I can understand that. And to be honest, I don't love the plot that much. The idea of burying something and it comes back, but not like how it was, it really isn't that compelling or scary to me, or at least for like 5 minutes it is, and then I'm over it. But I think this movie, and parts of it, stick with me, and I think the reason why is because this movie to me isn't really about the big plot with the magic cemetery. It's all about the little interactions with the characters and different traumas they face that makes it so compelling. And there's one scene in particular I think is way scarier than the cemetery evil scenes, and we're gonna get into that, so stay tuned because I'm about to talk about the aspects I liked. Okay, first of all, there's Judd, the sometimes dead is better neighbor. honestly, I love him as a character, and I love how the actor plays him. There's something endearing about him as the friendly neighbor, going on picnics with the family, offering advice, and showing Louis the evil pet cemetery that he later regrets. And then there's Louis and his traumatic experience at the hospital. So a jogger named Victor, who was hit by a truck, is brought to Louis's hospital, and Louis tries to treat him, but he unfortunately dies. But when Louis is alone with Victor, he sits up suddenly and grabs Louis, and he's like, "Louis, I'm gonna find you in your dreams, and here's some other cryptic things." And Louis is like, "How do you know my name?" And I'm not showing any of this because it's quite gruesome, but then later on, Louis has a dream that night, and Victor shows him the cemetery, and he's like, "Hey, don't mess with this." And it's really a scary moment for Louis as a doctor, and I just think it's a cool scene. I feel like Victor is trying to warn Louis as a thanks to him for trying to save his life, and that's kind of cool. I wonder more about Victor and how Louis feels about the whole experience, and that alone I just find more compelling than like the cat and the people coming back from the dead. But really, I can't delay it any further. There is one scene in Pet Sematary that I find not only terrifying, but it's emotional, honest, and deep. And that's when Rachel shares a traumatic incident from her childhood with Louis. You see, Rachel had an older sister, Zelda, who was sick. She was basically bedridden, or as Rachel put it, she was kept in the back bedroom like a secret. And Rachel had to sometimes feed and take care of Zelda while her parents were away, which honestly seems insensitive and irresponsible on the parents' part. And Rachel had a bad time taking care of Zelda. She didn't want to take care of her, and she was kind of afraid of her. Rachel very honestly shares some ugly truths about the situation. She tells Louis that she would often wish that Zelda was dead, but it wasn't just so Zelda's pain would end, it was so her and her family's pain would end too. One day, while Rachel is alone with her, Zelda chokes and dies, and as it's happening, thoughts are racing through Rachel's mind, and she's imagining what her parents will say when they come back, and she thinks they'll say, "You hated her, and you wanted her dead," and Rachel knew deep down that that was true. And after Zelda dies, Rachel runs out of the house screaming and crying, and her neighbors find her, and they think she's just mortified about her sister being dead, but Rachel admits deep down that she doesn't think she was crying, she might have actually been laughing. And Louis hugs Rachel after she shares this because he understands she was a child and that was a lot to go through. Okay, now hold on because I think we have some things to unpack here. First of all, I worry that the story could put disabled and sick people in a bad light because they make Zelda really scary looking, and that's part of the whole horror of the story, but I don't think that's the intention or really why the scene resonates with me so much. I think it was a really honest telling of the emotional reactions a child has in a situation that is probably too big and complex for them to handle. I don't think Rachel saying that she sort of wished her sister was dead was meant to say all sick people are a burden, but rather I think it was an honest look at the various emotions and thoughts that can go through one's mind when they're caring for a sick person at a young age, and it's a responsibility that shouldn't really be put on them. We don't know Rachel's parents and don't get to see them in this scene, and I think their absence says a lot. It sounds like Rachel didn't have someone to go to with her feelings, and it sounds like she was expected to be responsible and handle something she didn't really have the capacity to handle at such a young age. It's like she was carrying a big responsibility on her shoulders that should have been for an adult to handle. I don't know, am I reading this too much? I just find the whole story haunting. It's sort of an ugly story about an ugly experience, but it's also very human and it's honest. And really, Rachel didn't have a lot of control over the situation. Whether she bonded with her sister or not, caring for her and watching her die while she was alone was a traumatic experience. Also, Rachel's telling of the story feels honest and authentic. The emotion in her voice, the way her eyes tear up, she is sharing something that she is likely very ashamed of and has likely not really told anyone before. 'Cause I doubt her parents got a therapy. Also, I get that this really focuses on Rachel and not Zelda's experience. When you think about it, Zelda was sick, had a sister that was afraid of her, and basically died alone. Zelda is a victim in this situation too. But I think this story shows that even when people experience ugly thoughts or emotions they are ashamed of, they are not necessarily bad people who did anything wrong. Rachel was placed in a situation she wasn't equipped for and internally experienced distress that she felt deeply ashamed of and carried with her whole life. The horror wasn't Zelda, but really the horror was Rachel dealing with this ugliness inside alone. The horror was Rachel sharing something dark that many people would be afraid to share. I don't know, am I explaining this right? I feel like I'm gonna get misquoted. But really, all this is to say that we have a movie about a cemetery that brings people back to life, and yet it's this scene that sticks with me and haunts me. Now let's move on because there's one final thing I think is compelling about this story, and it sort of has to do with the cemetery and bringing people back to life, but it's not really about the scariness or the gruesomeness of it. It's really about grief and how the cemetery shows how grief can change us. Let's go back to Lewis for a moment because he's the one that keeps burying dead things in the cemetery even after he sees what it does to his cat, and even after Judd and the dead jogger warn him, and even after he sees what it does to his son. So Lewis seems like a reasonable guy. He works in medicine, he gets along with his neighbor, and he's understanding when his wife shares a traumatic incident with him. He seems to have a good head on his shoulders. And he deals with death as a doctor, so he's not completely shielded from it in terms of witnessing and experiencing death up close. But when the cat Church dies, rather than sit down with his daughter Ellie and have an earnest discussion about the inevitability of death, he tries to cheat death and bury his cat in the cemetery so that it will come back and Ellie doesn't have to be devastated. Now, in fairness, Lewis didn't fully understand what the cemetery was going to do, but I think this shows he tries to find an alternative to grief. And this is demonstrated all the more when his son Gage dies. Now, obviously, this is probably the worst thing that he has ever gone through, and I cannot imagine the grief he experiences. It's understandable that he would try to bring Gage back to life with the cemetery, even though he knows it will most likely not turn out great, just like with Church. He's willing to chance it for the minuscule chance that Gage could come back as himself. And then when he sees the horror of what his son turns into after the cemetery, and he finds his wife dead, he still can't handle the grief. He thinks that maybe this time around, if he buries his wife sooner, she will come back better than his son did. And as we see in the end, she doesn't, and it leads to his very demise. I think the cemetery is about grief and how, when we're feeling it, we do things we would otherwise not do. But like Judd said, sometimes dead is better, and I think more than that, sometimes living with grief is better. Or at the very least, Pet Sematary shows us that we can either choose to live with grief, or we can choose to let it take over, but the latter will be at our demise. So, a bit of a heavy topic. Anyway, I'm curious to hear what you think. Have you seen this adaptation and did you like it? Are you haunted by the Zelda scene and do you agree with my assessment? Are you bothered by the way Zelda is depicted? And what do you think about the way Lewis handled grief? Let me know in the comments, and while you're at it, please subscribe. Now, if you've made it this far, that means you like the video enough to maybe like some of my other videos. So check out this other video I've done that YouTube thinks you might like. Okay, thank you, bye!